Welcome all New York University students and students all over the world. I'm Edward Radzivilovskiy, student at NYU. Today I'm sitting down with Carne Ross, an economist, former high-ranking British diplomat, and founder and director of Independent Diplomat, a non-profit diplomatic advisory group. Mr. Ross has been a fervent supporter of Occupy and has recently appeared on shows such as the Colbert Report to discuss his latest book, called The Leaderless Revolution. Mr. Ross, in your book, one figure you don't quite mention, but of whom I'm sure you must have thought about while writing this book, is Niccolo Machiavelli. On one hand, there is a striking similarity between the both of you. Machiavelli wrote his classic, The Prince, at age 44, after 14 years of influence and prestige as an Italian diplomat. After a change in the regime, he was suspected of plotting against the government and imprisoned for some time. Your history is not dissimilar. After serving 15 years as a top-level British diplomat, with all the prestige that accompanies such a position, you leaked the then secret information about the Iraq War to the British press. You also faced possible criminal charges. However, these similarities aside, your experience as a diplomat has helped you develop very different political position than Machiavelli's. For example, perhaps the most famous of Machiavelli's statements is, "The ends justify the means." In your book, you argue otherwise, that the means justify the ends. What is your motivation in taking such a position?
Well, the means are the ends. The means should be the ends. That's precisely what I believe. I don't believe that the means justify the ends, nor do I believe that the ends justify the means. No, it's not my argument. It's Gandhi's argument that the means and the ends should be the same thing. That you can't expect peace by using violent means. Maybe in some circumstances you do, but in general you don't. These are not universal concrete rules about everything. But his view is that in seeking political change, you should use means that embody the change you wish to see. So if you wish to see democracy, non-violence, inclusiveness, then you've got to use those methods. You can't set up a secret vanguard committee that's going to use violence to achieve democracy, peace and inclusiveness for everybody else, which was of course in a sense the theory of change of the Bolsheviks, revolutionary communists in 1917. They believed that you could not liberate the proletariat without having a vanguard movement which was permitted to use violence. They very much adhered to the Machiavellian view of things. I do differ in that sense. I'm flattered by the comparison in all other respects. So just to correct one small thing, I didn't leak information to the press. I gave evidence in secret to an official inquiry, as I was invited to do. So I wasn't a whistleblower in that classical sense. But I think you correctly identified a clear point of difference, and I think it does help explain the difference between a belief in a state-based system and a popularly based system, an anarchist system. States believe they take to themselves the moral right to use violence to protect their populations or to pursue the interests of their populations. We give states this remarkable freedom to use amoral methods to pursue what states are supposed to do, the security and well-being of their populations. And this to me is a moral permission that we should question.
It's almost as if amoral becomes immoral.
Well, it's almost like it is. I use the word amoral deliberately in the sense that when you work for a state, you're not encouraged to think morally. You're not encouraged to think about the moral aspects of policy. It's almost like a morals-free zone.
Right.
But you're quite right in the sense that an amoral approach to policy leads to immoral ends. The use of violence, the use of torture. In my case, I was involved in a policy that I believe was ultimately immoral, namely sanctions against Iraq, which produced considerable suffering of the Iraqi people. For us, that was a means-ends argument. We believe that those painful means justified the end of containing the Saddam regime, which we believe would do much worse things if it was released from sanctions and allowed to rearm. But of course, the Iraqi people were not asked that question. They were not consulted in that. And that's that's one of the fundamental reasons I've come to review that the means do not justify the ends. It is not permissible to harm people for the greater good, because in fact, all you're doing is harming them. You're not, the thing you're doing now is the reality. It's not the future vision that you're hoping to create. You know, the West invaded Iraq in the belief that we would create democracy and stability. We don't have stability today. We don't really have democracy either. But in pursuing those laudable goals, we have perhaps caused the loss of 100,000 lives, which is, you know, those people don't get asked for their views of means and ends.
Reinvigorating a sense of agency is a big part of your book, to encourage individuals not only to complain about problems, but to also act in specific ways that address those problems. He also argued that the problem with hierarchies and authority is that they naturally remove a sense of agency. Why do you believe this? And in what ways do you believe a lack of agency to be problematic?
Well, starting with your last question, I mean, the lack of agency is problematic in two very important respects. One respect is that actually in terms of your own self-actualization as a person, you are restricting yourself. You know, you should be free to decide all of your circumstances, to decide, you know, all of your goals and ambitions and requirements in life, and be free to negotiate those directly with other people and to express them fully. That is, to me, a fundamental definition of what freedom is. And anything that constrains that is a constraint on freedom. It is making you less than you could be. It's in a sense making you less than human. But it's also important in the other respect, which is, I think, anything that limits your sense of agency does also limit your sense of responsibility. We've reached a position in the 21st century where, whilst we have democracy, a great many people who live in democracies don't feel responsible for what the government does in their name. Whether it's a war or, you know, allowing people to be imprisoned for unconscionably long periods, or you know, neglecting the worst off. This is just something somebody else does. It's they're doing it, but in fact it's us who's doing it. It's society who's chosen these outcomes, and yet people don't feel responsible for that. And giving people a sense of agency not only frees them, but it also introduces them, reintroduces them necessarily to a sense of responsibility, a direct responsibility for our own affairs. And I believe that those two things together would produce both a more cohesive society, a happier society, but also a more responsible society, a more grown-up society. I think the government and hierarchy turns us into children.
My next question deals with reform versus revolution. On January 6, 2012, I interviewed Noam Chomsky and asked him if Occupy should be seen as a precursor to a revolution, or if people should be trying to work up to a revolution. He told me, first of all, we are nowhere near the limits of what reform can carry out. People can have the idea of a revolution in the back of their minds if they want, but there are very substantive actions that should be taking place. Eventually, Chomsky argues, if these reforms can change the institutional structure of society, it could amount to a revolution. How would you respond to Chomsky's assessment, especially since at your recent appearance on the Colbert Report, you said that further reform with the system is not possible?
Yes, well, that's what I think, and I don't think I do agree that substantive reform, I mean, of course it's in theory possible. You should be able to produce these reforms, but I don't think they will happen given the circumstance that we find ourselves in. I think that you've got to take a power analysis to this. Who has power and who doesn't? Power inequality is growing along with wealth inequality. And power means that those with power, with the greatest wealth, have the greatest influence over policy. This is the way that representative democracy is working. It's not how it should work in theory, but in practice, what we have is that people with power and influence, say Jamie Dimon, who runs JP Morgan, he has much more access and influence over policy than you or I or Noam Chomsky ever will. If you agree with that analysis, you can't believe that reform is actually plausible, because in fact, those people, the powerful, will have much more influence over policy than we will. So the system is intrinsically prejudiced against meaningful, positive reform. I would like his theory to be true, and I don't believe that people should not subscribe to it. I think it's perfectly valid to push for that. And I do also agree that we're not talking about a revolution of, overthrowing the existing system in some violent or turbulent upheaval. It is a much more gradual, almost cultural change that we're talking about.
Picking up on the last part that you just said, you stated in your book, the immediate overthrow of government would bring only chaos. But as individuals and groups begin to assert their own agency over decisions and events within their own reach, there will eventually emerge a much wider and more fundamental effect, one that would ultimately amount to a revolution in how we organize our affairs. Also, delivering a lecture at the London School of Economics, you expressed your worry that if a state is using violence, that somehow violence would become legitimized for everybody. But if the state, which is the most powerful actor at play, and I think you just reiterated this point in the last question, then isn't the only effective counteraction violence as well?
Well, you've just described a perfect circle, haven't you? The state uses violence, it legitimizes violence for other people, and only the state can respond to that violence. So there you have it, a culture of violence, permanent violence. I don't think violence is a natural state. I don't agree with Thomas Hobbes that the absence of the state will produce violence of all against all. It's perhaps no wonder that Hobbes thinks that, given that he was writing Leviathan during the time of the English Civil War, when it was a plausible belief that without a strong central authority, you would have a war of all against all. But I don't assume, as actually representative systems of democracy, people who support state-based systems do assume that the alternative to a strong state is violence. And I do think that a state saying to itself, saying publicly to others that in some circumstances violence is justified, that creates a deeper kind of cultural understanding that there are sometimes justifications for violence. And the trouble is our states are now using violence in many, many more circumstances other than pure self-defense. We are elaborating more and more justifications for the use of violence, to the extent that today we're in a situation where we're in a state of permanent war. We have permanent cyber warfare being waged against our putative but undeclared enemies. We have drone remote control warfare being used in a kind of way that I cannot see ending, sort of endless conflict to eradicate the supposed enemies of the state.
I do think that the Occupy movement has definitely planted a seed of reform, a seed out of which a future polity may emerge from. But it seems to me so far, in 2012, Occupy does not seem to resonate as loudly with the American polity. Some critics who initially even supported the Occupy movement have said that aside from planting itself into the national discourse, it hasn't really been able to change the system. For example, Bill Maher on June 8th said, "Now that summer is upon us, the Occupy Wall Street movement must think of a more effective form of protest than camping. Occupy's motto is the only solution is world revolution. Okay, but what about setting our sights a little lower, like taking back Wisconsin?" Bill Maher is referring, of course, to what happened last week when the Wisconsin Republican governor, Scott Walker, a year after launching a controversial campaign against the state's public workers, won a historic recall election by a 7% margin, pretty much repeating the 2012 election Walker ran against Barrett. He even won 30% of union households in the state. So it seems to confirm the idea that those in power will do whatever necessary to keep it or expand it, and oftentimes do so very successfully. Is it time for Occupy to employ a new method?
It's a big question, and there's a lot of questions in your question. I think Bill Maher has some fundamental misunderstandings of the Occupy movement. I've never heard that motto, World Revolution, declared as the motto of Occupy. In fact, there is no single motto of Occupy. That's one of its great virtues. Perhaps one might argue it's also one of its weaknesses. There isn't a single message, there is a single concern. which is inequality and the state of the economic and to an extent the political system today. And Occupy is a movement that's trying to address this in many, many different ways. There isn't one way. It is a thing. Occupies many things. It is not one thing. So I think it's wrong to, say Occupy as if it's a single brain should think about a new strategy. Maybe it should concentrate on Wisconsin rather than the world. Certainly, I agree that local action is more powerful than taking things globally, demanding global change, because you change things globally by changing things locally. Your actions will spread, they will send a message, particularly in the highly connected world. Things that happen in Zuccotti Park are transmitted all over the world very quickly. There's been extraordinary international interest in Zuccotti Park. So in that sense he's correct, but I also think, personally I disagree that changing Wisconsin and unseating the Republican governor is a particularly useful thing to do. As we were discussing earlier, I don't think the reform of the current system is particularly plausible. Yes, in the short run it produces a better outcome. We have a Democrat in there, but I think historically the trends of inequality, damage to the climate, some fundamentally dangerous things for the future of humanity are not being addressed either by Democrats or Republicans. Inequality is increased continually through Democratic as well as Republican administrations. So, just concentrating on a few local political fights, yes, they're valuable in the short run, but in the long run I don't think they quite capture it. And I think that Bill Maher misses a very, very important point, which is that Occupy is an expression of a fundamental dissatisfaction with the economic order, and that will take time to change. And it is about consciousness raising. It is, as Todd Gitlin has called it, an awakening in a sense. And I think it may change things in many, many different ways that we can't quite know. Talking about it having to have a single strategy or tactic is, I think, a mistake.
So you would say that making it easier to recall a candidate wouldn't be substantial. You would have to eventually get rid of representative democracy.
Well, I think replacing it ultimately over the long run, and I do mean this is a gradual process, with grassroots democracy, with people taking part in decision making about their local circumstances, participatory democracy, where the mass make decisions for the mass. You do not have small elites, whether elected or otherwise, taking decisions for everybody else, because I think that hierarchical system, the few taking decisions for the many, is fundamentally corruptible and has been corrupted in the US system. It is far more stable, far more viable, uncorrupt, rejecting of partisan politics. If you have participatory democracy where you can have 50,000 people taking decisions about the budget for a city, as you have had in Porto Alegre, Brazil, for instance, and it demonstrably produces better outcomes, more equitable distribution of public services, schools and water or health services, and that is because everybody is involved in decision making. It is truly inclusive rather than purely nominally inclusive. So, I do think in the long run a new kind of political order will emerge from the bottom up that could ultimately replace the structures and hierarchies of what we call democracy today, which I don't personally feel is truly democratic.
Thomas Hobbes, as you mentioned before, is perfectly willing to compromise by sacrificing fundamental innate human capacities that make up individual freedoms, such as human reason and creativity, for the good of security and protection. Do you believe that security and protection cannot be guaranteed by government any longer? Or do you believe that it is simply not worth it to sacrifice things like creativity and reason for the sake of security and protection?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question. I wouldn't necessarily dichotomize them in that way. I don't think they're necessarily exclusive concepts. I certainly think that governments are not producing true security. I think that authority is helping lead to a fragmentation of society and unweaving of the bonds between us. If we were negotiating the future of NYU together, where you and I were truly making that decision. We would have to find a way of working together. You and I would develop an extraordinary personal relationship in trying to sort that out. We might hate each other, but it would be extraordinary. If that decision's in the hands of a few people you and I don't even know, we're likely not to feel very happy about that decision. We're likely to dispute that decision, and you and I will never get to know each other. So I'm suggesting that actually authority does actually undermine the fundamental bonds of society. That's one way in which our security as a society is compromised, but there is another way which I think is becoming increasingly evident in the 21st century, which is that states actually are using warfare in a way that perpetuates the threat to our security, whether deliberately or unconsciously, and I think frankly there is a bit of both. The methods that the US in particular has used, but also other countries, including my own, to combat what they call terrorism, will perpetuate that threat. We're now looking at threats of terrorism from individual autonomous groups of British men, Germans, Pakistanis, Moroccans, people from Algeria, Yemenis. That is not the original Al-Qaeda who launched 9/11. That is not those people. That is a different phenomenon, and yet it is a consequence of the methods we have used to fight the original Al-Qaeda. We have managed to spread the threat. We have managed to perpetuate it in a way that I think means that we will have that threat for a very long time. Indeed, perhaps, we won't see the end of it in my lifetime, maybe even not your lifetime, which is an extraordinary situation to find ourselves. We will have this ghastly sort of security presence in our lives, whether flying an aircraft or police on the subway. It's not that I've got anything against police, but this really suffocating sense, this rather frightening sense of a perpetual threat, which is I think something that governments, whether willfully or unwillfully, are perpetuating.
I presented this next question to Chomsky, and I'm interested to know your response too. The late British philosopher Martin Hollis, who dealt extensively with questions of human action, the philosophy of social science and rationality, claimed that any anarchist vision of a society rests upon an idea of human nature that is too optimistic. He argued that anarchism is only viable if humans by nature are good, but history shows us that humans cannot be trusted to this degree. Therefore, he argues, anarchism is too idealistic. Given your commitment to what you call cosmopolitan anarchism, would you mind responding to this objection?
Well, it's a very important objection, the answer to which is that anarchism has never been tried. So it is a presumption that humans are not good enough to make anarchism work. It is not an evidence-based approach, because actually a truly self-organized society of people managing and negotiating their own affairs has barely happened. It happened briefly during the Spanish Civil War in Republican areas of Spain, particularly in the north in Catalonia, and to an extent was successful, though of course it was a very brief experiment in self-organized society because they lost the war. The Francoists won, the fascists defeated them, so that system of organizing society was not allowed to continue. So a genuine experiment in anarchism has never taken place. And I would suggest that the 21st century, the circumstances of the 21st century, means that anarchism is actually more relevant today than it has been in the past, in that we have a highly connected global society where, because of the nature of globalization, that our problems are global in their origin and therefore their solution, that actually states are becoming less effective. They're not dealing with climate change, with economic volatility. These things are getting worse. So what would be an alternative thing that might deal with them? And paradoxically, you would think, well, maybe it's world government, and indeed this is the approach that, in a sense, the EU is taking, in response to the financial crisis, the economic crisis they are facing. They're saying, let's gather power even more closely together, have a banking union or a fiscal union, and that's profoundly anti-democratic. Europeans won't be allowed to vote on that. So I think there is a deep contradiction of world government. It's not democratic. It can't possibly be democratic. So that's a profound flaw. So I believe that the way to address these problems, which governments and states are less and less able to address, is in fact through mass movements, local agents organising together to address these things directly. It's not looking to other people to solve them, it is addressing them directly in their own local circumstances, in their own local way. And I think that is a plausible mechanism of change. I do accept it hasn't really been tried to its fullest extent, but I don't accept this belief that humans cannot be trusted with their own affairs, that humans have always demonstrated that they are, violent and prone to conflict. Well, we are in perpetual conflict now. We have a society that is pretty tense and fractured, where there is a kind of notable, palpable hostility in the public space. I don't think that we have stability and peace now. In fact, I think that many of the things that the state is doing is deepening the sense of instability. So why not give this alternative a try? We don't have to get rid of everything. We can just start doing it at a local level, and see what comes of it. Maybe it will emerge into a broader system where authority, where states are not actually necessary. Personally, I think states are going to disappear. They're going to become ever smaller. You see this trend everywhere of separatism. Scotland, for instance, is likely to become a separate state. This is because people want more control. Globalization is making them feel they have less and less control. I think people want to pull down agency and power to a level which is more meaningful to them. That's a very natural human urge. And actually, I think it might be a plausible way of actually getting to grips with these problems.
Aside from presenting a new political model, your book opens up a possibility for a new economic model. Of course, politics and economics are two sides of the same coin. But tell me about alternative banking. You are involved in the project to set up a community-style Occupy bank, if that's right. What has the process been like? Where are you now with it? And how will this bank differ from the ones that already exist?
Sure. Good questions. To which I can't provide very clear answers because we have not yet decided exactly what model of bank we wish to have. And instead we're actually trying to design a participatory process for all the members of the bank, the people who would use it, to decide what kind of bank it would be. That is not an easy thing to design, and it's taken us a lot of discussion to get there. And the process is not particularly easy because, working with a group of volunteers, of self-selected volunteers, you've got to work hard to find consensus, and that is quite sometimes a grueling process. But the fundamental belief of the group is that money is a public good. It is the basic means of exchange between us. It has become appropriated by a small oligopoly of for-profit banks who cannot be trusted with that responsibility, who have messed up that responsibility, who have exposed the whole world economy to astonishing risk. The financial crisis caused enormous damage to the world economy, above all to the poorest. And that systemic risk will not be removed by Dodd-Frank or, frankly, any other financial regulation that we might see emerge from capitalism, precisely because Jamie Dimon has much more influence there than we in the Occupy Bank working group have. So our view is, why not try to build a better system, a better form of banking from the bottom up that would be transparent, democratic, accessible to everybody, that would not use practices like kind of extremely risky, highly leveraged derivatives trading of derivatives nobody understands, for instance. Not doing things like that would expose everybody else to systemic risk. You take those principles, you start to be able to envisage what kind of bank that would look like. And that's what we're working towards. I'm not saying we're going to succeed. Other people should try it too, because I think it would take minds greater than mine to make this work, and greater than ours in the group. But I think it is the correct objective. I think that the appropriation of the control of money by a few profit-seeking entities is not a successful way. It does not produce a system that is operating in everybody's interests.
Is it working? Right. In your book, you also make the claim that though globalization has created some benefits for society and has made the world smaller on one hand, it has also been responsible for making the world more atomized, fragmented, and inegalitarian. Is there a way to resolve this paradox? To make globalization, which seems to be a very heavy and compounded term to begin with, is there a way to make it work? And do you see Occupy, which has spread worldwide, as addressing this issue?
That's a very difficult question, partly because, as you correctly say, globalization is rather a big term for lots of different things.
Is there a way to define it, or?
Well, global phenomena, I suppose, whether it's global trade, the global economy, the global environment, these are functions of globalization.
Mm-hmm.
We're now looking at global systems rather than systems that can be best understood or best managed at a national or smaller level. I suppose that's my pretty rough and ready definition. As I say, I think there is a way of making it work, but it is a paradoxical way, which is to go down to actually a much more grassroots approach to political change, rather than hoping that the UN or the EU or the nation state itself will be able to produce a global solution to a global problem. And perhaps that may be part of it, but actually we can't absolve ourselves of that responsibility ourselves, because it isn't working. To leave it simply to that level of human management of governments and international organisations is not succeeding. It is not working in controlling these really very fundamental severe problems, like, for instance, climate change. And I think that acceptance that that is not working is terribly, terribly important in the first place. And it says to us we have to find better ways. And I think human ingenuity, its ability for collaboration, has a plausible chance of being able to solve some of these problems. So let's actually pursue that as a method of change, instead of relying on a very ossified, static model of change, which is what we have been, by tradition and by history, predetermined to do.
I spent my freshman year of college at NYU abroad in Paris. And I remember the day when François Hollande was elected the next president, and when, in his acceptance speech, he told the people of France that the austerity measures would stop. Crowds stormed to the Bastille landmark, celebrating his election and the new government, and with the hope of new economic policies it would bring. It was a really thrilling experience for anyone that was there to witness it. The people in France and elsewhere seem to have realized, and they know, that austerity measures simply do not work in a time of recession and great economic hardship. Do you think that the European Central Bank is intentionally acting in a way that creates a deeper divide between the rich and the poor?
I don't know. I don't have much insight into the private thinking of the ECB. I doubt that it is intentionally doing that. I really do doubt it. I'm sure that people who are in it are sincerely trying to do what they think is best. Also, the ECB has a very tight constitutional mandate. It can only do certain things, and many people would argue it's already overstepping its mandate in terms of, basically trying to address monetary policy, reflation, essentially, through monetary policy by recapitalising European banks, etc., etc. That's basically what it's being asked to do by politicians, and that's not fundamentally, as I understand it, its original responsibility. So I don't think necessarily it's deliberately seeking to do that. The key is not the ECB, it's Germany. They hold the keys to EU-wide policy, macroeconomic policy, policy to manage the Eurozone, and they have chosen a policy of fiscal restraint, of budgetary rigor, discipline as the way out of this crisis. And I think one of the reasons you saw that incredible upsurge for Hollande and that incredible some kind of sense of political momentum was because in Europe at least it is very clear that it is not working. It is pulling Greece's economy into an absolute disaster. And at the moment it is pulling other economies too into disaster. Spain had a very solid budgetary situation. It was not hugely overspending like, for instance, Greece was, and yet it is being pulled down by the requirements of budgetary restraint. And there are other factors as well. It's not only austerity. but is being pulled down into a situation of economic collapse. You know, it is very severe what's happening in Spain, and who knows who's next? Perhaps Italy, perhaps Ireland. Austerity also imposes very severe social costs. You know, it isn't just a budget line being cut, it's people losing work, it's people having less, and you know, people suffering privation because of it. Grave, you know, psychological distress. There is a real price for it. And I think the evidence from the EU is that it has not worked, and that there has to be a more aggressive reflationary strategy.
You have made it clear that all systems of hierarchy usually embody oppression and thus should be eliminated. What are your thoughts on the prison industrial complex, a term that was coined by Angela Davis, who argues that it is essentially an extension of slavery in the United States and elsewhere? Should it be abolished?
It's an extension of slavery in the sense that, like slavery, it's morally justified by the people who practice it. You know, they think that they have a moral justification for locking up millions of people for very long periods. I don't think they are morally justified. I don't think we have the right to do that to each other. I think the necessary social pressure for people to behave correctly is not best served by punishment. And you know, the more acute aspects of the military-industrial complex, which I think is a great term, by the way, is that you know the prison industry now has economic interests of its own in expanding the prison population and certainly keeping it as high as it is now. There's been a massive increase in the prison population in America over the last 10, 20 years. And that has been coincident with a massive increase in privatization of the prison industry, where you've got now large private companies who are lobbying in Congress, who have their own lobbyists for longer prison sentences, for new prison to be, more prison to be built. And this is an extraordinary aspect of the market interfering with a fundamental social challenge for society, how to keep order. So I think it's a really grotesque phenomenon that we're witnessing now, and of course there is a deeply racial aspect to it. I don't think it's a coincidence that the war on drugs was declared more or less as the battle of the civil rights was successful. You know, it was a new way of keeping the minority population down, in a sense. And I think it's very clear that African Americans, Black Americans have been totally disproportionately targeted by prison policy. You know, everybody knows, for instance, about the distinction between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Everybody knows that African Americans are much more likely to be stopped and searched. It's something like 40 times more likely than white people. And how can that possibly be indicative of anything other than a prejudiced approach to criminal policy?
So, getting back to my other question about intention, and kind of relating it to your answer to this question. When you say that the prison industrial complex, it has certain economic interests to expand. When you say that there is a certain prejudice involved, I feel like that, I mean, the prison industrial complex is obviously also part of government, and I feel like government also has its own interests and wants to expand those interests. Even if those interests interfere with, obviously, you know, people at the bottom whose interests are different. So does that suggest a possible intention for the people who want power to keep it, and to intentionally disregard the people whose interest is in conflict?
Well, having been in government, I don't think these things are ever clear as intentions inside government. They're just cultural habits inside institutions. When I worked in a long-standing institution of government, it was very striking that some of the most important things of that institution were not what it was set up to do. It was set up to manage Britain's foreign relations, but actually the thing that got everybody's attention was resources for the ministry, people's pay. What was our annual budget going to be? People got very agitated about that before they got agitated about, the crisis in Iran. I'm not saying they didn't get agitated about the crisis in Iran, but there was a very clear ordering of priorities, and this is what anarchist institutional analysis tells you. Institutions develop their own set of interests, and these are separate from the purposes for which they were established. Having worked in the UN, it's very clear to me that the UN has sets of interests which are different from the UN Charter for which it was established. The UN, one of the UN's undeclared interests is the security and well-being of its staff. It's not an illegitimate interest, but it is not declared. And so I found, for instance, I helped set up a weapons inspection body in Iraq. This was to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction when Iraq was run by Saddam Hussein. I was rather astonished to discover that this thing was still existing. It was 5-6 years after the Saddam Hussein regime had been got rid of. I helped set it up. And I never imagined that this thing would outlive the purpose for which it was established. I know of foundations that, having spent all of their money, philanthropic foundations that, having spent all of their money, then decide that they are so useful that they need themselves to be funded. This is how institutions perpetuate themselves and develop sets of interests which are different from the ones that they claim. So institutions are inherently problematic, governments are inherently problematic, they have to be constantly checked, they have to be transparent. And above all, ideally, they should be spontaneous, and they should be abolished once the purpose for which they're established is fulfilled.
Moving towards more foreign policy, in a June 14, 2011 article by CNN on the Syrian government's crackdown on protesters, you said that the Security Council had failed to act appropriately. It has been almost exactly a year since you said that. What has been the progress, if any?
Pretty much zero, tragically for the Syrian people. There's been an attempt at a peace plan formulated by Kofi Annan, which has failed. Though it's still in play, I don't see any prospect that it will be adhered to, that the fighting will stop. The fighting is intensifying, getting worse, but it's becoming more and more militarized on both sides. And the Security Council is still doing nothing. It's essentially supported the peace plan, but that's it. It has not agreed, for instance, an arms embargo on Syria, which I think is disgraceful. It is disgraceful that Russia is still shipping significant amounts of weaponry to the Syrian regime. I think it's despicable. At a minimum, that's what we should be doing. Stopping weapons getting to the regime. This regime is killing its own people in large numbers. They should not be armed. And I think they should be targeted with specific measures to make their lives as difficult as possible and to convince them to stop and to come and negotiate with the opposition elements to form a new dispensation.
When is it okay to interfere militarily? How do we avoid another Iraq?
Well, my views about that have shifted. I did used to think that, those circumstances were relatively clear and it was right to intervene. Now, I think the idea of humanitarian intervention, of intervening for the better interests of the local population, has been sullied by the Iraq intervention. It is therefore become a less legitimate idea internationally. That's not to say, though, it isn't still important in some circumstances. If you talk to a Libyan from Benghazi, for instance, as I did recently, they will tell you, had it not been for NATO's intervention, they would be dead today. That's pretty compelling. I find it hard to dismiss that line of argument. And I don't condemn routinely all Western military activity just because it's Western military activity, though I've got a great deal of criticism for most of the manifestations of Western military strategies today.
And so for my last question, Margaret Thatcher, a very popular conservative British Prime Minister.
She wasn't that popular. It's a complete myth. Yeah, she was one of the most divisive politicians in British history. She was hated in Britain by a lot of people. So she wasn't popular. Please don't believe that.
All right. But she's famous for expressing her belief that there is no such thing as society.
Yeah.
And that there's just a collection of individuals. That's also, I think, similar to Ayn Rand's argument. In your book, you agree with her premise that society is a collection of individuals, if that's right. But you disagree with her ultimate conclusion, of course, about the role of government. So I'm just wondering what leads you to agree with the premise but disagree with the conclusion.
Well, it's partly about the mechanisms that you choose to fulfill social purposes, the necessary purposes of living with other people, the necessary duties of living with other people. I mean, I think that it's not just pure libertarianism. We don't have an absolute right to pursue our own ends to their fullest, regardless of other people. I think we have a duty to consult other people, to consider them, and to take care of them if they're vulnerable or weak or suffering. So these things do fit together with my vision of the individual at the heart of freedom, of our expression of what it is to be human. Curiously, although ostensibly libertarian, a bit like the Republicans, these people claim to support individual freedom, but at the same time they actually support a very authoritarian view of government. A very heavy hand in terms of criminal justice, for instance. A very moralistic view of how government should operate, a very moralistic view of society, of what society's moral rules should be, imposed from above, not generated indigenously, as I would suggest is much better, much more enduring, and much more adhered to and supported by the population itself. So I think there are grave inconsistencies in her philosophy. She believed in a government, a society, or individuals that ruled with a very firm role by Margaret Thatcher herself, the school teacher and headmistress in chief.
All right, well, Mr. Ross, thank you very much for agreeing to do the interview.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you to New York University, to the Liberal Studies program for supporting this project. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Great questions. Taking the books so seriously. You really did
it was really a very inspiring book.
Well, I appreciate that. It really means a lot to me that you took it so seriously. Thank you. And that's why I wrote it.